My name is Richard K. Pate. Welcome. Thank you for the opportunity for me to share this true story from the Old West with you. We know this story thanks to the Remembrance album of Harriet Pruden. This all started for me in my family's storage unit. Around the turn of the century, that's when I came across this old album. When I asked, no one in my family knew where it came from or what it was. It just appeared. I like to say that it found me. I knew instantly it was something special when I saw the cover. Like a worn, wrinkled, and aged face, the once brilliant embroidered bouquet on the cover is still hauntingly beautiful. When I opened the album, I saw dates ranging from 1831 to 1909. The next thing I noticed is that it was filled entirely with handwritten poetry. But not all in the same hand. Many people had written in this little book over a very long period of time. Needless to say, I was hooked and determined to find out about this very cool story that must be behind this amazing primary source document. The story I eventually discovered was amazing and so touching. What I had found was a 175-year-old real-life American Romeo and Juliet story told in the language of love, poetry. Harriet was 16 years old in 1830 when she fell in love. She was one of 13 children and lived in Athens, Ohio, where her family enjoyed an upper middle-class lifestyle. Harriet wanted for nothing. She had security, clothes of the finest cloth, a stout timber-framed two-story home, and lavish entertainment. She was also universally beloved in her hometown, as I would soon discover. My job was first to transcribe the 100 or so poems. I spent 6 months doing so after dinner each night. Finally, when I had that done, I could really read them for the first time as a collection. At the same time, I started writing various historical societies where I knew the album had been, for any information that the historical record might have on this poetic mystery. I hadn't read all the poems yet, but the album readily let me know that a young, beloved woman was leaving home and that people were worried for her well-being, very worried. Once I understood some of the poetry, and when I started receiving information from the historical record, other details of the story started to emerge. What floored me was how much the story was being chronicled by these poems. While the historical record provided events and facts, the poems provided the feelings associated with those events, as told by the people who lived the events. When I put all this together, the dry historical facts sprang to life as if in 3 dimensions. The poems were working together to help tell this story, like a poetic quilt, where each poem was a single square of the quilt. I had never seen anything like it. I'm not a poet or a poetry expert, so I assumed I would find other examples of this use of verse. To my amazement, I have never found even a single other example. This may be the only one, but I hope not. I call the poetry collection a narrative poetry anthology, or NPA for short. That's a term I coined to accurately describe this collection of poetry to others. An NPA is defined as a collection of poems by multiple authors which chronicle the same story in real time as the story unfolds or progresses. According to researchers at the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, and other sources, they have never seen another example of a narrative poetry anthology. Additionally, none had ever seen any album with such a long life or with so many contributors. Harriet was, like the other Pruden girls, groomed to marry well and live in an eastern civilized town. But Harriet had other plans. She had the wanderlust, an affliction of her day which drew people into the vast unknown wilderness of what was then to the white man still an uncharted West. Harriet wanted to be a part of it, so she rejected the army of well-to-do suitors she had at home. Instead, she chose a man of little means. He was in 1830 but a poor carpenter from out of town. But he had what the other boys could or would not offer, a ticket to the West. Harriet's choice was Emmanuel Light, who had relatives already in the West living as settlers. Harriet fell for Emmanuel in part because he could be counted on to get her out of Athens, Ohio, and on the trail. Harriet's friends and family were appalled at this prospect. Doing this in these early days was inviting certain death. How could sweet Harriet possibly survive out there for long? When all the other efforts failed, they came up with the idea of a poetic intervention, and the album was born. Somewhere around 30 or 40 people gathered in secret and created the first chapter of the album. They carefully selected and crafted their contributions. They even got a local professor to guide them. His name was A.G. Brown. A.G. would have the honor of writing the very first poem to Harriet on the first leaf of the album. The poems all reminded Harriet just how loved she was at home, how she would be sorely missed, and that she was making a mistake that might cost her her life. Being the Victorian age, none of this was said directly. One has to read between the lines. Now imagine how powerful a gesture that was. 40 or so poems. I doubt any of my friends would even write me a single poem, much less 40. Their efforts worked for a while. Harriet and Emmanuel put their adventure on hold. In spite of the efforts of an entire village, by 1837 Harriet and Emmanuel had eloped and married away from Athens. By 1840 they had made it to what was then most definitely the West. They found themselves as one of 12 settler families on the banks of the Little Elkhart River in far northern Indiana. Harriet's dream had come true. She was a participant in the unfolding drama that was the settling of the West. The album goes with them and records the voices of the people they meet on the way. In these new poems, we get a glimpse of how Harriet was received in the wilderness and a sense of how she fared there. She went from being a spoiled girl who wanted for nothing to a poor girl who had nothing, unless she made it herself. The poem suggests that Harriet fit right in and became as much of a joy to her new neighbors as she had been to her many friends and family back home in Ohio. While the poems from Indiana do not have the impressive spit and polish of the Athens poems, they are just as heartfelt. The historical record notes that the winters of the early 1840s were absolutely brutal in far northern Indiana. Perhaps this was the reason, but in any case, by 1853, the urge struck the Lights again. They pulled up stakes and headed even farther west, to California, during the gold rush. The final chapter of the old album begins in 1853 as the family crosses overland in their wagon en route to California. The album was lucky to survive the trip. As you may already know, many family belongings were abandoned on the side of the trail. There are no poems which clearly indicate that they were written on the difficult trail. The historical record, however, makes clear that the family lost their youngest child on the crossing, likely to cholera. The trip was not for the faint of heart. They crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains before the snows of 1853. Once they had arrived, the album emerges again to record two beautiful folksy poems which speak of the marriage of one daughter and her subsequent leaving of the family to do so. The second poem speaks of how Harriet's eldest son leaves the family, perhaps to prospect for gold. Both are bittersweet in tone, as you might imagine. In any case, neither of these people is ever again mentioned anywhere in the historical record that I have found, certainly not in relation to the rest of the Light family. Perhaps they were never seen again, as was the case with Harriet when she left Ohio. The Lights, however, were not prospectors. They were farmers. They proceeded on out of the mountains to Tulare County in central California. Once again, at that point, the album gets a new caretaker. In 1875, when Martha Ann Light comes of age, the final chapter is told mainly by Martha Ann. She was born in 1860 in Tulare County, and in 1875, when she inherited the album, they had migrated north to Sonoma County, their final destination. Martha Ann Light contributed more poems to the album than anyone else, although many new poems from others filled up the remaining leaves of the old album. Martha used the old book as her personal poetry album more so than the other caretakers before her. Her favorite subjects were birds and birdsong. She never signed even a single one of her poems, but did sign her name elsewhere in the album. Because of that, I was able to match her handwriting to her poems. The amazing journey of Harriet's album finally ends 80 years after it began and almost 3,000 miles from its point of origin. In that time, over 70 different people contributed to it, from every walk of life, from an Ohio governor to dirt poor settlers. This story was not unique. In that time, many young people must have escaped west to be together. What is unique is how the story is chronicled here in the language of love. You can see images of many of the original poems at Harriet's Facebook page. And please visit Harriet's website at www.rkpate.com for more information. While you're there, be sure to check out the list to see if one of your ancestors contributed a poem to the album. You can also get guidelines to start an album like Harriet's for your own family. And of course, you can buy a copy of my book where I present all the poems along with a fictional blurb where I imagined I was interviewing each poet at a 175-year reunion. That way I could ask them and they could answer directly. Who are you? How did you know Harriet? And what did you think of her plans to elope and become a pioneer settler? Thank you so much for listening to my story.